For the past 4 decades, the tightening grip of prison overcrowding has been choking the United States. A consequence of the unending war on drugs that has played a large role in this key issue. Over 52% of the U.S. prison population is incarcerated on drug offenses. On average, 4 out of 5 of those inmates is incarcerated for minor drug possession. Many of these inmates get little to no help for their drug use, and this lack of help is leading to the United States' massive recidivism rate and does nothing to reduce the country's consistent drug abuse. On the other hand, as a way to confront the high rate of drug abuse along with a large crime and imprisonment rate, in 2001, the country of Portugal decriminalized the personal possession of all drugs. With the passing of this legislation, the country's general population had a decrease in continuous drug use and has led to the country's prison population dropping from 44% to 21%. The legalization of drugs has also allowed the police force of Portugal to record and focus on much more violent and detrimental crimes plaguing the country. Although a complete decriminalization of drugs is a somewhat drastic solution, and legislation this big will likely not be passed anytime soon, it may be good to look at a simpler solution for now. That solution being to change or abolish the draconian minimum sentencing laws put in place in the 80s as a way to target higher-level drug offenders such as dealers and distributors. Sentencing laws such as this have mostly affected drug possessors in the end. As a result of these laws, many peaceful possessors of drugs get sentenced to years in prison and fined a large amount more often than not. According to the law in Kentucky, which has the harshest punishment of at least 2 years incarceration and a $20,000 minimum fine, a stark contrast to California with only a couple months and a minimum fine of $50. The biggest problem with this being that the users locked into prison end up being exposed to more violent criminals and gangs, which, according to the scholarly article Viewpoint, many of the people who get locked up end up falling into more violent crimes and end up having trouble re-entering society. So my first question, Kadia, is, on average, how many drug-related cases do you handle in a year?
On average, we have about 5,500 drug-related cases. The cases can vary between, or can range between marijuana offenses to heroin, cocaine, and then it also varies between whether it's a possession of marijuana and the weight of it. And then there's also the intent to deliver, which is a different classification, but it also pertains to drugs. So if you take all of those into consideration, we have about 5,500 drug-type cases that are referred to our office every year.
And secondly, I want to ask, and how do you judge the severity of a drug offense?
Yeah, it goes by weight, and then weight and what the intent is. So obviously, if a person, I guess, I don't know how common it is, but a person, if they're pulled over and they have like a joint or a very small amount of marijuana, like I said, if it's under 2 ounces, then that's considered a Class B misdemeanor. Those are misdemeanors. Now, if you're caught with a very, very large amount of marijuana, then I would say, I don't know, depending on the circumstances, but it could be with intent to deliver, and that could be a felony, a first-degree felony, and that could be punishable from 5 to 99 years in prison. So it just really depends on the weight and the type of drug and what the intent is. But obviously, most of the time, if you're caught with very, very large amounts of drugs, then it's more than likely a delivery charge, which carries a higher punishment.
There's one more way to reduce the massive prison overcrowding through the change of the current drug legislation that has been an offshoot of the failing war on drugs being waged by the United States. That change being to start to focus more on rehabilitation of drug addicts and users rather than simply punishing them. In fact, there are 2 examples of extremely effective rehab programs actually implemented in the United States, which still had offenders serve time but offered a program that they could stay on both inside and outside of prison. The program had great results for those who stuck with both parts. The result being that 3/4 of the prisoners that completed it stayed off drugs and out of prison for good. Another program noted by the Justice Policy Institute mentions one in Maryland that actually led to a 2/3 success rate of keeping addicts off drugs and even led to a reduction in crime in the surrounding area of the city. Now, there are many ways of thought and points used to oppose the changing of current drug legislation within the United States. One such being that with the decriminalization of drugs, the amount of addicts and crimes related with drugs will rise exponentially. Reducing or abolishing the minimum sentencing laws will be too lenient on offenders and will lead them to going about abusing drugs and breaking the law. Finally, many might say that a larger focus on rehabilitation will be exponentially more expensive than simply putting them in prison. When it comes to the first point, the decriminalization in Portugal has actually led to a decrease in crime and drug use within the country as a 2014 study. The second opposing point is based on little or no sentencing minimums being too lenient. As it turns out, eliminating these minimums will give judges more jurisdiction over how to better help each case and will allow them the power to even put offenders in rehab. And finally, when it comes to a focus on rehab being much more expensive to put in place, is actually the complete opposite. It turns out that putting offenders through rehab is cheaper and more cost-effective than just simply locking them up. So essentially, they get help for their problem, and it's cheaper than being thrown in prison without any help. Drug policy in America needs to change, whether it be by implementing policies that have found success in Portugal, reducing or abolishing the minimum sentencing laws that has thrown many peaceful people into a dangerous gateway for more crime and displaces them once they leave. And finally, to shift the nation's focus onto that of rehabilitation and reintegration rather than a zero-tolerance punishment and stigmatization that it brings. The United States is one of the biggest leaders and influencers in the world. It's generally seen as a bastion of progress for the greater good. Yet when it comes to helping those with addiction or keeping others safe from the harm of drugs, the US ends up being one of the most draconian with its war. Now, there aren't many things that you yourself can do as an individual to help solve this problem. However, there are things you can do, such as writing your congressman and staying in touch with the subject, voting on policies that might change the current legislation with drugs and even prison itself. Also, a good thing to look at is maybe even going to protests or demonstrations.